On the morning of May 27th, the Russian fleet entered the strait in a long, straggling column. Fog clung to the water, thick and gray, reducing visibility to a few thousand yards. The sea was calm, almost glassy, for a brief moment. Some of the Russians allowed themselves to hope that perhaps the weather would hide them, that perhaps they could slip through unseen and reach Vladivostok before the Japanese could intercept. Then the fog began to lift, torn apart by a light breeze from the west. And on the horizon, sails appeared. Aboard the Japanese flagship Mikasa, Admiral Hikaru Togo stood on the bridge and watched the horizon clarify. He had been waiting for this moment for 8 months, tracking the Russian fleet's agonizing journey across 3 oceans, drilling his crews relentlessly, positioning his squadrons with surgical precision along every possible approach route. Every ship under his command knew its role. Every gun crew had practiced until loading and firing became mechanical instinct, movements so rehearsed they could execute them in darkness or chaos without conscious thought. Every captain understood the plan and had memorized the signals that would coordinate their movements. Togo didn't need to improvise. He had already won. The Russians just didn't know it yet. The Japanese fleet had 89 ships, but numbers weren't the advantage. The advantage was preparation. 8 months of it, obsessive and methodical. While the Russians had spent months decaying at sea, Japanese sailors had drilled in these exact waters, learning every current and tide pattern. While Russian gunners fired practice rounds sparingly to save ammunition, Japanese crews had fired thousands of shells, refining their aim until they could hit targets at ranges the Russians considered impossible. While Rozhesensky's engineers nursed dying engines with makeshift repairs, Japanese mechanics had tuned every boiler and turbine to peak efficiency, every ship operating at maximum capability. And Togo had speed. His battleships were faster, more maneuverable, their hulls clean and engines reliable. His fleet could accelerate, turn, and maintain formation, while the Russian column lumbered forward at the pace of its slowest, most damaged ships. It was like watching wolves circle wounded prey, predators so confident they could afford to be patient. Togo also had something the Russians had lost somewhere in the Indian Ocean: the absolute confidence that comes from perfect preparation meeting a demoralized enemy. At 1:39 p.m., Japanese scouts confirmed visual contact. The Russian fleet was exactly where Togo expected, steaming northeast in a ragged line. Rozhesensky's formation stretched for miles, battleships at the front, older cruisers in the middle, supply transports trailing behind, the whole column moving at barely 8 knots. It wasn't a battle formation. It was a convoy trying to survive long enough to reach port. Togo gave the order. The Japanese fleet turned to intercept. What happened next became known as crossing the T, a naval maneuver so devastatingly effective that it represents the absolute pinnacle of battleship tactics. The concept is geometrically simple. Position your fleet perpendicular to the enemy's line of advance, forming an AT shape, so that all your guns can fire broadside while the enemy can only return fire with their forward turrets. Your entire broadside, every gun on every ship, concentrates fire on the enemy's leading vessels, while they can only respond with a fraction of their firepower. Execution, however, requires perfect timing, precise navigation, absolute confidence, and crews trained to act as a single unit. A mistake in a turn exposes your fleet to devastating fire, while ships are vulnerable and out of position. Hesitation creates chaos. Any miscommunication can turn the maneuver into a disaster. Togo had all 3 prerequisites, and he had one more advantage. He knew the Russians were too slow, too exhausted, and too poorly trained to exploit any momentary vulnerability. At 2:02 p.m., with the Russian van barely 6,000 yards away, close enough that men on both sides could see the faces of their enemies, Togo raised the signal flags that would become legendary. The message was simple: the fate of the Empire rests on this battle. Let every man do his utmost. Then he ordered the turn. Every Japanese ship pivoted to port in sequence, turning 16 points, a complete reversal, so that they crossed directly in front of the Russian advance. For a few minutes, the Japanese fleet was vulnerable, each ship turning individually, exposed to potential Russian fire as they maneuvered. It was a moment when an alert, aggressive enemy could have punished the Japanese severely, concentrating fire on ships as they completed their turns. But Rozhesvinsky's gunners were too slow, too exhausted, too unfamiliar with their weapons to exploit the opportunity. Russian shells began falling only after the Japanese turn was nearly complete, splashes erupting in the ocean where Japanese ships had been minutes earlier. By the time Russian fire control officers calculated new ranges and bearings, the maneuver was finished. The Japanese line formed perpendicular to the Russian advance, and every gun on every ship trained on the leading Russian battleships. And then the slaughter began. The opening salvos from the Japanese battleships landed with a precision that shocked even Togo's own officers. Shells bracketed Russian ships immediately, one salvo short, the next long, the third smashing directly into superstructures and gun turrets with an accuracy that seemed impossible at 6,000 yards. The Japanese weren't firing blind. They had rangefinders calibrated to perfection, gun crews trained to adjust between shots based on spotter corrections, and ammunition designed to maximize devastation on impact. Russian shells, meanwhile, splashed into the ocean hundreds of yards off target. The geometry of the engagement worked against them. Firing from the bow meant only forward guns could bear, perhaps 2 or 3 turrets per ship versus entire broadsides from the Japanese. When Russian shells did hit, many failed to explode, duds from poorly maintained magazines, ammunition stored improperly during the long tropical voyage, powder charges that had absorbed moisture and burned incompletely. The few that detonated often punched through Japanese armor without triggering internal explosions, emerging from the far side hulls and vanishing into the sea, a testament to Russian shell design that prioritized penetration over blast effect. The Japanese, by contrast, fire high explosive rounds that detonated on contact, turning Russian decks into infernos. Shells struck superstructures, bridges, gun turrets. Each impact sent shrapnel siding across open decks where Russian sailors stood exposed. Within 15 minutes, the Russian flagship Naya Suvorov was burning from stem to stern. Shells had destroyed her bridge, killed most of her senior officers, and shredded her communications equipment. Signal halyards hung in tatters. The main mast tilted at an angle, half severed by a direct hit. Rozhesvinsky himself was wounded, shrapnel tearing through his skull, blood streaming down his face, his vision blurred and consciousness fading. He was carried below decks by sailors who themselves were wounded, while above them his fleet disintegrated. The Russian formation began to collapse. Ships turned independently, captains making desperate decisions without orders, trying to escape the devastating crossfire that was tearing their vessels apart. Some veered north, others turned south. A few tried to accelerate forward, hoping to close the distance and bring more guns to bear. The neat column dissolved into chaos. Individual ships maneuvering without coordination, no unified command, no plan except the primal instinct for survival that overrode training and discipline. Togo's fleet moved like a single organism. As the Russian line fragmented, Japanese squadrons adjusted instantly, maintaining the perfect firing angle, shifting targets as Russian ships turned, pouring shells into every vessel that presented itself. Cruisers accelerated to cut off escape routes. Destroyers positioned themselves for torpedo runs. The coordination was flawless, the result of 8 months of drilling, practicing, executing the same maneuvers until they became instinct. The sea between the two fleets became a vision of industrial hell. White columns of water erupted where shells landed, some rising 50 feet into the air. Black smoke poured from burning Russian ships, mixing with the gray smoke of gunfire until the air itself became opaque. The sound was deafening. The thunder of heavy guns, the shriek of shells passing overhead, the crash of impact against steel, the secondary explosions as magazines cooked off and boilers ruptured. Osliabia, a Russian battleship, took hit after hit along her waterline. Japanese gunners had identified her as a threat and focused fire with mechanical efficiency. Shell after shell punched through her hull below the waterline, flooding forward compartments faster than pumps could compensate. The bow dipped lower with each minute. Water poured over foredeck, swirling around anchor chains and gun turrets. Men scrambled toward the stern as the ship tilted forward at an increasingly steep angle, and then, almost gently, as if sinking with the most natural thing in the world, she slipped beneath the surface, bow first, propellers still spinning as she vanished. Hundreds of sailors went down with her. Survivors thrashed in the water, coated in oil, choking on seawater mixed with fuel. Some clung to debris. Others simply floated, too exhausted to swim, waiting for rescue that might never come. The Japanese didn't stop firing. Naya Suvorov drifted out of formation, a floating wreck with no steering, no communications, no command structure. Her guns were silent, crews dead or dying. Her deck was a tangle of debris and bodies, steel plating peeled back like torn paper. Fires burning unchecked in compartments that had no water pressure to feed hoses. She circled aimlessly, rudder destroyed, engines failing, no longer a warship, but a monument to destruction. Japanese destroyers closing like sharks drawn to blood, launching torpedoes from point-blank range. One struck amidships with a geyser of white water. Another hit near the stern, the explosion so powerful it lifted the aft section momentarily out of the water. The flagship shuddered, rolled slowly to port, hung there for a moment as if deciding whether to survive, and then capsized. Rozhesensky, barely conscious, was pulled from the water by a Russian destroyer that had somehow survived the carnage. Most of his crew died when the ship went down, trapped in compartments that flooded in seconds. By 4 p.m., less than 2 hours after the first shots, the Russian battle line had ceased to exist as a fighting force. 7 battleships were sunk or sinking, their hulls settling into the Pacific. Cruisers burned, listing heavily, crews abandoning ship into waters already crowded with debris and drowning men. Transport scattered in every direction. Trying to escape, engines pushed beyond their limits. The few Russian warships still capable of fighting were surrounded, outnumbered, taking fire from multiple directions with no possibility of coordinated defense or effective return fire. Japanese losses? 3 torpedo boats were damaged. 117 men were killed. The mathematics of the engagement were staggering and spoke to a disparity, so profound it barely qualified as combat. Japanese gunners achieved an accuracy rate of approximately 85%, shells landing on or near target with almost every salvo, spotters calling corrections that gun crews executed within seconds. Russian gunners, exhausted and poorly trained, operating weapons they barely understood, managed closer to 10% accuracy, and most of those hits were non-fatal due to defective ammunition. It wasn't a battle. It was a firing exercise with live targets that couldn't effectively shoot back. As dusk approached, the slaughter continued without mercy. Japanese destroyers hunted down crippled Russian ships, finishing them with torpedoes launched from ranges so close that misses were impossible. Survivors in the water watched their fleet disappear, one ship after another sliding beneath the waves, taking men and machines into the dark Pacific. Some sailors simply stopped swimming, too exhausted and demoralized to fight anymore, letting the ocean claim them. By nightfall, the Tsushima Strait was a graveyard. Oil slicks stretched for miles, thick in rainbow sheen, catching the last light of day. Bodies floated among debris, wooden planks, life preservers, pieces of superstructure bearing Russian inscriptions. The few Russian ships still afloat were scattered, leaking, desperate to escape under cover of darkness. Most wouldn't make it. Japanese destroyers prowled through the night, hunting by the glow of fires and the silhouettes of damaged ships against the stars, methodically finishing what daylight had begun. When dawn broke on May 28th, the destruction was complete and total. Of 28 Russian warships that entered the strait, 21 were sunk, gone to the bottom in water too deep for salvage. 7 were captured, boarded by Japanese Marines who found decks slick with blood and crews too exhausted to resist. Only 3 small vessels managed to escape, limping into neutral ports where they were interned for the duration of the war, survivors telling stories that nobody wanted to believe. Nearly 5,000 Russian sailors were dead, their bodies scattered across the Pacific floor or floating in currents that would carry them for weeks. Over 6,000 were captured, herded into prisoner of war camps where they would spend months before repatriation to a country that had already moved on. The Baltic fleet, 8 months in the making, 18,000 miles traveled, built at costs that had strained the Russian treasury, had been annihilated in an afternoon. Japan's losses? 3 torpedo boats. 117 men were killed. A handful of ships with reparable damage. The disparity was so extreme it seemed fictional. The silence that followed wasn't just the quiet of exhausted survivors or the absence of gunfire. It was the sound of an old world dying and a new one being born in blood and fire. News of Tsushima reached Europe and America within days. Carried by telegraph cables that spanned oceans the Russian fleet had taken months to cross. The reaction was seismic. Editorial pages erupted in shock and analysis. A European power, an empire that stretched from Poland to Pacific, one of the great powers that had dominated global politics for centuries, had been utterly destroyed by an Asian nation that had only emerged from feudal isolation 50 years earlier. Every assumption about racial superiority, industrial dominance, technological advantage, and the inevitability of Western imperial expansion cracked under the weight of that single afternoon. In Russia, the defeat accelerated a collapse already underway. The revolution of 1905, simmering since Bloody Sunday in January, exploded into open revolt. Workers struck, peasants rioted. Naval mutinies spread through what remained of the fleet. The Tsar's grip on power weakened with each passing week. The myth of Russian military invincibility, already damaged by defeats on land at Mukden and elsewhere, shattered completely. Tsushima didn't just sink ships. It sank the credibility of a regime, proving that incompetence, corruption, and arrogance were no match for preparation and discipline. For Japan, the victory was transformative and elevated the nation to great power status overnight. Togo became a national hero, his name spoken alongside Nelson and other legendary admirals in naval academies worldwide. Japan secured a favorable peace treaty at Portsmouth, mediated by Theodore Roosevelt, gaining territory in Manchuria and Korea, extracting financial concessions, and, most importantly, gaining international recognition as a major power that could defeat European empires on equal terms. The message was clear and could not be ignored. A non-Western nation could not only compete with European empires, but decisively defeat them using their own tools: modern warships, industrial production, disciplined tactics, and superior preparation. Naval academies around the world studied Tsushima obsessively for decades afterward. The crossing of the T became a textbook maneuver, analyzed in classrooms from Annapolis to Greenwich. The importance of gunnery training, fire control, range-finding equipment, and fleet coordination became embedded doctrine. The battle proved that technology alone wasn't enough, that exhausted, demoralized crews operating advanced weapons would always lose the prepared, focused, disciplined sailors with superior training and leadership. Material advantages meant nothing without the human element to exploit them. But the deeper lesson was simpler and more brutal. Wars are won long before the first shot is fired. They're won in training yards where gunners practice until their hands bleed and loading becomes muscle memory. In engine rooms where mechanics tune machinery to perfection, eliminating every inefficiency. In staff rooms where commanders plan not for battle they want, but for the battle that's actually coming, studying their enemy's weaknesses and their own strengths with ruthless honesty. In months of drilling where crews learn to function as a single organism, responding to orders instantly without hesitation or confusion. The Russians had ships, excellent ships, in fact, many of them equal or superior in design to their Japanese counterparts. What they lacked was everything else: training, maintenance, leadership, morale, and most critically, the understanding that preparation is the difference between fighting and dying. The Japanese had readiness, complete, total, obsessive readiness. And readiness, when it met unpreparedness in the narrow waters of Tsushima, turned a battle into an execution. In the years that followed, divers explored the wrecks scattered across the strait. They found gun turrets still loaded, shells never fired, evidence of crews who died before they could complete even one more salvo. They found engine rooms where coal remained piled beside boilers that had gone cold forever. They found the physical,